What number are we?
We are
12.
on number 12.
12. Good God.
Yes.
Well, friends, welcome to Give the People What They Want, which comes to you, sorry about that, which comes to you every Friday in the evening in India, in the morning in the Americas, with Zoe and Prashant from People's Dispatch, and me, Vijay from Globetrotter. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you know, we're on Facebook Live, but we're also, of course, a podcast on all the normal platforms. You can. Yes, I know. I know. My camera was moving around. Well, this week is this week is the World Social Forum. It also is the World Economic Forum. We'll come back to that because the World Economic Forum, come off it. What are they going to teach us now? The world is still in turmoil. There are strikes everywhere. We had told you last week that on the 26th of January, Indian farmers were going to enter Delhi. Prashant, what's the latest story with the Indian farmers and the struggle? Tens of thousands of farmers revolting around the country. What's happening, Prashant?
Absolutely. It's a very critical situation right now because what we are seeing is that I'll come to the protest, of course, on the 26th, but what we're also seeing is that there is a very concerted attempt by the state, by right-wing forces that have an affinity to the ruling BJP, to disrupt this protest, to unleash violence wherever possible. So around Delhi, there is definitely an air of tension because there have been a number of attempts of this sort. So to go back to the 26th, the plan, of course, was that the farmers who have been camped around Delhi for over 2 months, they reached Delhi on November 27th. They set out on the 26th of November, that they would enter Delhi in tractor parades. And there were 3 parades that were planned. The routes had been pre-decided with the permission of the police, of course. The tractor rally began on the 26th morning. Most of it was peaceful. As per everything that had been agreed upon, it was an amazing logistical maneuver, so to speak, considering these thousands of tractors from 3 different points entering a congested city like Delhi. It was a very, what do you call it, very remarkable logistical move. One section of the farmers, though, did break away from the determined route and they went into the heart of the city. There were confrontations with the police. Some of the farmers ended up at the Red Fort in Delhi, which has a lot symbolic significance for the people of India because of its history and stuff. And some of them hoisted a religious flag on the ramparts as well. Now, of course, there's a movement. There's often, people expect there's this weird understanding of where people expect movements to sort of always be obsequious and only listen to what the authorities say. There's often a lot of chaos, a lot of disorder. In this case, there is a lot of speculation, and the farmers' movements have made it very clear that what happened on that day was not their plan, and that there were probably some sabotage or provocateurs who were there in that spot trying to sort of push things in that direction. And people even have been identified, people close to the ruling BJP, who were involved in that kind of activity. But nonetheless, this has been used by the ruling establishment and by the media, which is especially alarming, to sort of paint this picture of these protesters who have been around Delhi for 2 months, struggling for their rights against these 3 horrible farm laws, to paint these protesters as terrorists. And this has been an extremely, if you look at the reporting on that day, it was, say, all the TV channels, the expressions ranged from outright, branding them as terrorists on air, to this kind of shock and concern because the farmers had actually entered the city of Delhi. The people had entered their capital, and there was just this shock and concern and horror and anger among the media, as though that the capital of the city is not for its people. So that it was a very disturbing aspect in the media on one side. On the other hand, definitely the state seeing this as an opportunity to maybe break the farmers' agitation. So after the 26th, for the next 2 days, there were reports of cases being filed. There was a lot of statements being made which were in that direction. Yesterday, that's on Thursday night, they tried to evict the farmers from this region called Ghazipur, which is on the border of Delhi and the state of Uttar Pradesh. And that move seems to have backfired because the farmers leader over there, Rakesh Tikait, he sent out a very emotional message talking about how he was willing to sacrifice himself to keep the protests going. And this seems to have led to a fresh resurgence of the movement. There are reports of mobilizations taking place all across Delhi, meetings taking place, gatherings taking place. Calls have been given for farmers to come back, some of them who left, to come back to those protests. And with this, suddenly, that I wouldn't say the tide has turned, but there's been a bit of a change in the mood. So right now, it's still very tense because the farmers are very clearly angry because they have been patiently waiting for 2 months to get a hearing, and the government has not responded in a meaningful way, according to them. And instead, it has been branding them in all kinds of negative ways. And there are right wing elements on the loose which are trying to sort of paint this as some kind of anti national activity. So right now, a very tense situation. It's a very significant struggle. They've got solidarity from across the country. So I think in the coming days, especially for our viewers, for our listeners, it's very essential to keep watching India, because the 26th was in some senses maybe even a beginning for a fresh wave of mobilizing as well. So that's the scene right now.
And when you say watch India, of course, we are asking people to follow newsclick.in for really the best coverage directly from the front lines of the farmers' struggle. It's newsclick.in. The farmers, of course, are fighting to have the repeal of 3 outrageous laws which, end state intervention into the farming sector, price supports, and so on. I just want to put something on the table. The European Union spends $65 billion a year subsidizing its farmers. United States government has spent $1.7 trillion over the past 20 years subsidizing its farmers. And yet it's the IMF and others that say that farmers in other parts of the world must not receive state intervention. So the issue picked up by the Indian farmers is actually not just for Indian farmers. I think, we should see this as a global defense of agriculture and the agrarian life. It's not just Indian farmers revolting right now. We go over to the Americas. I was reading a report at People's Dispatch about healthcare workers in Peru on strike, a long strike from them. Zoe, what's happening with the healthcare workers in Peru?
Yeah, well, healthcare workers in Peru have been on strike for the past 2 weeks, since January 13th. Demanding really basic demands of quality PPE, timely payment of salaries. Peru is a country that has, super privatized systems. So, for example, there are a lot of contract workers who haven't been getting their salaries on time. They're also demanding, above all, which I think is interesting to see as more of a structural demand, an increase in the budget of the public health sector in Peru, because it currently makes up 2.4 of the GDP of the health budget is the health budget in Peru. So they're really demanding, that the state invests more in the sector, which should be a pretty easy demand given the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And we've seen time and time after again that the public health systems are really the only systems that are able to take care of the people that are responding to this crisis. Yet they're still in the negotiation process. They're still, it's a massive, massive strike. And of course, when healthcare workers go on strike, it means that, I think they always are trying to guarantee that there's a timely delivery of services, but it really is putting their lives on the line to make sure that their demands get met. And of course, the demands are not just for their own personal fulfillment and betterment. Of course, having salaries is not just one's betterment, but they're really demanding that this sector be improved for all of Peruvian society. So they've been on strike since the 13th. It is likely to continue. And of course, as we've talked about, a couple months ago on the show, actually, Peru is currently in a political crisis after the parliamentary coup. And so it is a structural problem in Peru of underfunding the public sectors, taking this money for, the pockets of the Congress people. And so I think it's really valiant that they're pushing this at this moment, seeing the power of people's uprisings in Peru and what that can accomplish, and that hopefully they'll be able to get this really important demand, which is increasing funding for the sector. And by the way, another on the same mountain chain of the Andes, is exciting news for a country that's been similarly embroiled in neoliberal crisis, and which is Ecuador, another country that has seen their public health sector be utterly dismantled over the last 4 years, really, under the government of Lenin Moreno. And, of course, the people have been waging very, very strong battles against neoliberalism in the country. And currently, as we mentioned last week, the electoral race is hot and heavy. And this next Sunday, February 7th, Ecuadorians will head to the polls. And the latest poll is saying that Andrés Arauz, who is the progressive candidate who has vowed to reverse all these neoliberal policies. I mean, as you mentioned last week, there are some of these policy moves that Lenin Moreno has taken, are trapping Ecuador into for several years. But, where possible, Andrés Arauz has committed to bettering the situation. He has a very clear plan on how to deal with this economic crisis, which I think is really important. It's not just big ideals and values of humanism, but he actually has a clear route on how to pull the country out of this crisis, and he's polling in first. It remains to be seen if he'll be able to clinch the 40% that he needs to win in the first round. He's currently 8.8 percentage points away from winning this, and of course that would be amazing if he won in the first round, but we'll see what happens. And that will be really interesting to watch. It's happening February 7th, next Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, this is a key election. There's a series of elections on the western flank of South America this year, Ecuador, Peru, and then in Chile. And I think we'll be following each one of them with a great deal of interest. And again, People's Dispatch is the place to learn about what's happening around the world, what struggles are taking place around the world. Don't forget to visit the site. I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening in Davos, in Switzerland, where the World Economic Forum is meeting once again, the annual meeting. So rather anodyne meeting. Once again, the agenda coming out of Davos, the so-called Davos agenda, seems to be basically warmed over last year's agenda. There's very little in there that's of interest. The Chinese President Xi Jinping made a fascinating speech calling for more collaboration, less confrontation, including in macroeconomic policy, setting of the policy agenda for countries. China, the one country expected to grow this year, maybe up to 7.9% growth, which is very high, depending on how this new strain of the vaccine impacts China. Last year, China grew by 2.2% is the estimate. We'll get the exact number later. That's a fair amount of growth, given that most of the world's economies, had a narrowing, had a decrease in growth. Well, growth is not the only issue. The issue is, of course, that China has seen the abolishment of poverty in the course of the year. And so for the Chinese president at Davos to talk about the need for collaboration should be something that people welcome, because it's basically the locomotive of the world economy at this time. During this meeting, every year, Oxfam, the British charity, releases a report on inequality every year. This year's report, it was expected, because the evidence that Oxfam accumulates is actually a lot of it is based on prior research that was released. But there's just something in it that made me feel ill. That is that the 10 richest people on the planet Earth, 10 people, okay, I don't know what the current number is, 7 billion of us on the planet Earth. 10 people, not 10 million, not 10,000, not 100,000, whatever, just 10 people. That means the fingers on my hands. 10 people increased their wealth by $500 billion during the pandemic. I mean, Jeff Bezos, of course, in the lead. It is just mind rattling to see what this means. I was very interested inside the report to learn, that there's a lot of details in the report. It's quite interesting. One of the places where I felt, again, quite troubled was I didn't realize that Afro descendants in Brazil are 40% more likely to get COVID-19. And the impossibility of getting vaccines into places like Brazil and other parts of the world is related to this 10 people making $500 billion, because this $500 billion is more than you need to get 2 vaccinations to everybody on the planet Earth. I mean, that's what's stunning, is just the increase of wealth would be enough to vaccinate everybody and to put paid, at least to some extent, to the pandemic. But, I mean, how far are we from this? It's pretty extraordinary. Instead, of course, we don't have clarity and collaboration. We have the kind of things that's going on in Poland, where it's in the middle of a civic crisis. I mean, is this the moment to push a hard right agenda? I mean, Prashant, Poland, People's Dispatch has covered Poland. Is this the time to push a hard right agenda? Shouldn't we be taking a position of collaboration to lick the vaccine? I mean, to lick the pandemic, to move an agenda of humanity? What's happening in Poland?
Absolutely, Vijay. It's quite disturbing, as you pointed out, primarily because we've covered this in one of our earlier shows as well. There was a constitutional court judgment in Poland in October, which basically barred abortions in case of fetal defects. Now, Poland already has a very restrictive abortion regime. It's only allowed in cases of rape, incest, and threats to the life of the mother. And fetal defects were also there until October, when it was banned. And this had led to mass protests in Poland, of course, the National Women's Strike, Razem, the leftist party there, so civil society groups, an entire generation of young people coming out to the streets and protesting against this constitutional court judgment, talking about how they had the right to autonomy, the right to decide over their bodies, over their sexual health, and how the government had no right to do that. And for a while, these protests did make an impact. The government was sort of forced to go on the back foot a bit. It delayed the adoption of this judgment. But what happened on Wednesday, this Wednesday, was that suddenly it was announced that the justification for this judgment would be published in the journal, the government journal, which basically means it's adopted. And this again spurred another fresh round of protests. There have been calls for protests today, tomorrow, until the 31st by the National Women's Strike, for instance. And yet again, like you said, this points to the sheer absurdity of the hard right. In some senses, it's not absurd, it's actually to be expected. But if you look at the Law and Justice Party government in Poland, this is part of a very, very long-term agenda that they've had. The last time the protests broke out, we talked to our comrades in the Razem, who talked about specifically this issue, that the issue of abortion, the issue of social conservatism is not something that just came with this government. Of course, it was a product of the post-communist regime that emerged. During the communist regime, abortion was legal. And the post-communist regime makes this, pact with the Catholic Church, as Zofia Malis said of Razem, that they make this pact with the Catholic Church whereby they concede some of these agenda, and then as time passes, this agenda is further and further established in the state. The Law and Justice Party, of course, has taken this to a much, much further degree in Poland. Similarly, in Hungary, there's the Fidesz party, which is of a very similar ideology. But the Law and Justice Party has also done something very common. I think our viewers across the world will recognize it, which is it has massively tampered with the judicial system. So starting from the Constitutional Court to the Supreme Court, this is what Trump has been doing. This is what's been happening in India, in Brazil, in so many places. You sort of enact this lawfare in its various forms. And the judgment we saw in October was in some senses a culmination of that lawfare, where your entire judiciary is taken over by the right wing across the world. They identify that this is one key place where they can hold back the progress of society, hold back the progress of the ideology and thinking of young people really who want to build a very different world. So the judiciary again serving as a very strong barrier to this. The way forward, it's still a bit still unclear, because the what this means in immediate terms is again huge difficulties for women in Poland. Of course, at least 100 to 150,000 women travel outside Poland every year for procedures because of the restrictions. That number is probably likely to increase. But what we can, I think, also say is that this struggle and the kind of movements it has generated, for instance, National Women's Strike, they've become a very permanent part of Poland's political landscape as well. And despite the Law and Justice Party and despite its control over the judiciary, I think that these movements will nonetheless continue to push, their agenda, push their demands on the ground until they're met.
This whole business, this is grotesque. I mean, honestly, it's the 21st century, and I think editorializing on this issue is perfectly permissible. I mean, in Argentina, we just saw the brave long-term struggle, people to get the right to control, women to control their own bodies. And, let's be precise about it. This is about abortion. And it's ridiculous. It's a medical procedure. It's so heavily moralized. It's not just in Poland. 25th of January is celebrated in Honduras as Women's Day. Zoe, there was, Honduras, Prashant talked about women who leave Poland to go get treatments that requires money to leave. In Honduras, women don't have recourse to that kind of money. What do they do? And what were they doing recently?
Yeah, talk about pushing hard right policies in the moment of complete, crisis and deep economic distress. Honduras, we've spoken about on the show before, and we've at People's Dispatch, we've covered it very closely. But Honduras has been immersed in a deep, deep social, political, economic crisis, I think, really since the coup in 2009. And on January 1st, the National Assembly in Honduras decided to pass a law that essentially bans abortion, rebanning abortion, because Honduras is one of the countries in Latin America where abortion is criminalized. It's not legal in any exceptions. Women go to prison for having abortions. And this law essentially bans abortion again and makes it almost impossible to legalize abortion. And of course, why would this be the interest of a government in the midst of such a horrible crisis? We saw a couple weeks back, thousands of people leaving Honduras, forced to flee their homes because of this crisis. But what's interesting to point out is that after the coup in Honduras, one of the first things that the government did was ban misoprostol, which is one of the in the morning after pill also. So the agenda against women in Honduras has been there since day one, this conservative agenda. And then another thing to point out is that this is a country that has some of the highest rates of violence against women. So, not only are women, forced to get abortions because of productive rape and other things, when in other countries, if you're raped, you do have a right to abortion. In a lot of countries, even in Latin America, where it's a lot more restricted. In Honduras, you do not. And so, estimates say that between 51,000 and 82,000 abortions are performed in unsafe and clandestine conditions. And we know that those conditions are condemning women to potentially death. And beyond this, also, it's one of the countries with the highest rates of femicides. So really, it's abhorrent. It's abhorrent that this kind of law would be passed in the midst of its crisis. The law also bans same-sex marriage. It takes a very, unnecessary hardline position, and I think it's really, it's horrible. But the women of Honduras are continuing to organize, and they're continuing to push for their rights because they have always mobilized. We see there's so many incredible Honduran women that have, stood out in the past decade in terms of their, determined conviction to mobilize against the regime, against this dictatorship, which is just full of, horrible contradictions. This is a government whose president has been accused of drug trafficking in U.S. courts. In U.S. courts, he's been accused of drug trafficking. Yet he has the audacity to crack down on women's rights, to not respond to any of the horrible situations that we've seen develop in Honduras over the past couple of years. So, I mean, it's really all of our solidarity and support to the women in Honduras who continue to resist despite such, adverse conditions. And also want to point out that the candidate in the upcoming presidential elections for the Libre Party is a woman, Xiomara Torres. So I'm sure we're going to be following, her development, her candidacy, and what are the prospects in Honduras for enacting change.
The women of Honduras, the women of Poland, both together. I just want to recommend to viewers to look at the tricontinental publication, Corona Shock and Patriarchy. And the reason I'm bringing it up is, 70% of care workers around the world are women. And when there's all this rhetoric about, privileging or putting ahead essential workers and so on, you're attacking the women's right to a political life, essentially. I mean, I'm making the situation in Honduras and Poland a political question. It's not just a medical question. So please take a look at that. The text is called Corona Shock and Patriarchy. Well, it's not been an entirely negative week, because on the 22nd of January, a treaty went into force, which I wrote about for People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. This is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's essentially a ban treaty. Nuclear weapons are banned by a General Assembly resolution. Of course, the nuclear weapon states don't accept this, and they haven't, either signed the treaty, or in fact, they boycotted the signing day, the day of the vote. They didn't show up. So they didn't abstain. They just didn't come. They didn't take their seats. I mean, there's a real snub at 122 countries that took a very serious decision to ban nuclear weapons. In the article, I decided to go back and reflect on the writing of Wilfred Burchett, because he has moved people like myself. He's a great Australian journalist who in 1945 went over a 7-hour train ride from Tokyo to Hiroshima. He was arrested as soon as he arrived in Hiroshima, less than a month after the atom bomb fell on that city. And while the US government in Tokyo was saying that there is no after effect, that the radiation dispersed, because the bomb explodes above the city, Burchett went and saw fish dying in rivers and so on. And I just wanted, if you don't mind, to read the first bit of that story. He says, in Hiroshima, 30 days after the first atomic bomb destroyed the city and shook the world, people are still dying, mysteriously and horribly. People who were uninjured by the cataclysm from an unknown something, which I can only describe as atomic plague. This was written in 1945. It was headlined in the Daily Express as a warning to the world. 1945. We are in 2021. 122 countries have come together and said, ban nuclear weapons. And they are being pressured by the nuclear weapons states. The United States is pledging to spend trillions of dollars to upgrade the arsenal. Has now very dangerous, battlefield nukes, deployed around China. I really want people to pay attention to this ban treaty and to read about it, find out about it, educate others about it. For us as reporters, we bring stories to people. We bring you the story, but that's not our job. Our job is to bring you the story so you take the story to somebody else. So we are asking you to take our stories into your own conversations with people. Campaign on the stories if you feel that it's something that you can campaign or should campaign on. What we do is only one part of the process. We would very much like you to take the process forward. Every week you join us here at Give the People What They Want. We have a superb producer. Surangia is helpful not only in setting everything up, but also providing the links if you watch us on Facebook Live. We very much want you to go to People's Dispatch and follow the reporting that takes place over there. Very much want you to do that. But of course, you'll come back next week and join us and listen to us again on all the podcasting platforms, because I mean, I know this show is chock-a-block. Somebody wrote to me recently, said, "Can you make it an hour-long show?" I'm not sure we have the stamina for that. Prashant, Zoe, would you like to go to an hour?
I'm not very sure either. There's just too much to talk about. Nonetheless, the half an hour show has its own. Yeah, it's a very difficult question.
Right. It is a difficult question. Zoe, you're interested in an hour-long show, or are we happy with half hour?
I'm interested in giving the people what they want. So, that's the will of the people.
Right. It's the will of the people. On the other hand, it takes a lot of effort to bring a show like this. We are a community, and we enjoy bringing it to you. We'd like you to please tell other people about Give the People What They Want, share our program. We really do enjoy doing this. The nice thing about the three of us working together is that there really is no tension between us. So come back next week for Give the People What They Want with Zoe and Prashant from People's Dispatch, and myself, Vijay from Globetrotter. A group of three, no tension between us, lots of tension in the world. See you next week.
Next time.